Chapter 31, Unseen Force. Kevin pressed on through agonizing pain, dragging his injured leg behind him. Determined to reach the ground floor and escape this nightmarish place, he gritted his teeth against the sharp jolts of agony that shot through him as he limped forward. "Tanya! Steve!" he shouted. "Where are you?" "Tanya! Steve!" No one answered but the relentless downpour. He paused, leaning against a wall. Blood flowed from the gash in his leg, but determination drove him onward. Gritting his teeth, he pushed forward into the darkness. He called their names again, his voice echoing through the empty corridor. His flashlight illuminated crooked, old pictures, making him feel off balance. The corridor seemed to tilt, causing him to lose his footing. The solemn faces of patients in the photographs took on an unsettling quality, their expressions slowly warping into sinister, evil smiles. The old black and white photographs of nurses and patients suddenly came alive with cruel cackling, which grew louder and louder, driving him to the brink of madness. "Shut up! Shut up!" he screamed, voice raw with desperation. Abruptly, the laughter stopped. The pictures froze, returning to their original state, solemn, lifeless faces staring blankly from cracked frames. He stood motionless, heart racing, waiting. Watching. Expecting the mockery to restart at any moment. But nothing moved. Nothing changed. Just old, forgotten photographs hanging silently on the wall. He moved on, limping through the darkness. Suddenly, a door at the far end of the corridor burst open with a violent crash. Kevin froze, dread coursing through him. Before he could react, something unseen hurtled toward him with terrifying speed, slamming into him and sending him sprawling backward. Stunned, Kevin struggled to rise from the floor. He strained against the pain, finally managing to get to his feet. A sharp ache shot through his leg, nearly toppling him again. He stumbled, bracing himself against the wall for support. Breathing heavily, he looked around in a panic, his heart racing. Heavy footsteps echoed from the end of the corridor, as if a giant were stalking him. Thud. Thud. The sound was loud and menacing, steadily advancing toward Kevin. Gripped by fear, he turned and moved as fast as he could, dragging his injured leg behind him. He steadied himself against the wall, fighting to remain upright. The pain in his leg was excruciating. For a moment, he nearly blacked out. Thud. 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 The footsteps drew closer, each impact reverberating with a sinister intensity. Kevin could feel an unseen presence looming behind him. Thud. Thud. It was inches away. Ice-cold breath tickled his neck, raising the hairs on end. He dared not look back. Knife-like claws ripped through his back without warning. Kevin's scream of agony echoed through the corridor as he pitched forward, face slamming against the solid ground. His nose shattered on impact, blood gushing across the floor. Blinking through watery, pain-filled eyes, he twisted to confront his attacker. The corridor stood utterly empty, silent and menacing. Blood seeped from the wounds on his back as Kevin dragged himself forward, every movement a battle against pain. He braced himself, expecting to hear the thudding footsteps of the invisible entity once more. But there was only silence, broken only by the faint whisper of wind and rain. Summoning his last reserves of strength, Kevin dragged himself further along the corridor. Finally, he reached its end, where two imposing doors stood before him. With monumental effort, he struggled to his feet, his leg and back screaming in agony, his nose still gushing blood. Through watery eyes, he leaned against the doors, pushing his way through with trembling arms. Chapter 32, Inside the Women's Wing. He stumbled into darkness, nearly falling again, but regained his balance. his flashlight lost in the corridor when the unseen force had thrown him. Blind and disoriented, he moved cautiously through this new space. The acrid scent of lingering smoke told him where he was in the women's wing. Just as he was about to turn around, the double doors behind him burst open with a thunderous crash. The heavy thuds returned, quicker now, a frenzied sprint. Thud 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 thud. The invisible entity was charging, closing the gap with terrifying speed. It was right behind him. He was slammed with tremendous force, sent hurtling through the air as if struck by a charging bull. Before he could even recover, it hit him again. He flew backward, crashing through the "Danger, keep out" sign and tearing through the flimsy yellow plastic strips. With a bone-jarring thump, he hit the ground, pain exploding through his body. The blackness enveloped him like a shroud. Chilling laughter echoed from behind, sending a shiver down his spine. He glanced over his shoulder into the void, seeing nothing. The laughter ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "Why don't you leave me alone?" Kevin screamed, his voice filled with terror and pain. Blood gushed from his nose, filling his mouth. He wiped it away with a trembling hand, smearing it across his face. Disoriented and desperate, he turned and stumbled through complete darkness. He had no sense of direction, no idea where he was going. The blackness was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow him whole. The acrid smell of burning assaulted his nostrils and stung his eyes, adding to his disorientation. Suddenly, his foot caught on something unseen and hard. He pitched forward, arms flailing, and crashed onto a jagged surface. "Fuck!" he yelled as pain exploded through his body. Sharp edges dug into his flesh, and he realized with a start that he had fallen onto a pile of bricks. The earlier sound of falling masonry now made horrifying sense. He lay there, motionless, as despair washed over him. The will to fight ebbed away, leaving only a hollow resignation. The entity had won. What was the point in prolonging this agony? "Take me," he screamed into the void. "Just kill me now," he begged, his voice cracking. "Get it over and done with, you bastard." A minute of deafening silence passed. Then, horrifyingly, his own voice echoed back, distorted and unnatural, "Take me. Just kill me now. Get it over and done with, you bastard." Realization dawned on Kevin. It was playing with him, mocking his desperation. Anger flared, momentarily overpowering his fear. "Fuck you," he screamed. With renewed determination, he struggled to extricate himself from the pile of bricks, every movement sending shards of pain through his battered body. Finally on his feet, he pressed on through the pitch black, hands outstretched, occasionally stumbling over unseen debris. He stopped. He could hear the faint screams on the other side of the wing. The screams of women. They were getting clearer and louder. Kevin froze, his blood turning to ice. Women's voices, shrieking in agony, seemed to surround him. A cacophony of terror and pain assaulted his ears from every direction, disorienting and horrifying in its intensity. In this moment of auditory hell, Kevin stood paralyzed. The screams were deafening. He covered his ears and sank to the ground, as the nightmarish chorus continued unabated. The screams morphed into cackling laughter. A chorus of derision surrounded him. Kevin struggled to his feet, his body protesting with every movement. "What the fuck do you want from me?" he screamed into the void, his voice cracking with desperation. He staggered forward, each step a battle against pain. His back stung and his nose trickled with blood. As he took another tentative step, the floor beneath him groaned and creaked. All at once, with a deafening crack, it gave way. Kevin plummeted through darkness, debris raining down around him. He slammed into the floor below, the sickening crack and snap of bones echoing in his ears. Pain unlike anything he'd ever experienced exploded through his body. He tried to sit up but found himself paralyzed. Tilting his head forward, he saw his legs twisted at an impossible angle. Defeated, he let his head fall back. Tears streamed down his face as he lay in the semi-darkness of the lower corridor. He wished the fall had killed him. Instead, he remained alive and agonizingly aware, the searing pain keeping him conscious. Staring up at the jagged hole above, watching dust trickle down, Kevin accepted the inevitable, he would be dead soon. As this grim thought settled over him, another loud rumble shook the building. Bricks and plaster from the women's wing above began to topple, cascading through the gaping hole in the ceiling toward him like a deadly avalanche. He watched, helpless, as the debris rained down. The weight of concrete and brick piled onto his broken body, crushing him further into the floor. Crumpled and broken, Kevin lay beneath the avalanche of bricks, entombed in absolute darkness. Each labored breath became a desperate struggle, his lungs fighting futilely against the overwhelming pressure. He gasped, a rattling, painful sound in the darkness, and with one final, ragged breath escaping his lips, he surrendered and joined the darkness forever. Chapter 33, Tanya and the Dark Entity. Tanya suddenly found herself on a staircase, as if she had just awakened from a vivid nightmare. Confusion clouded her mind as she struggled to focus on her surroundings. The darkness of the stairwell engulfed her, amplifying her disorientation. As her bearings returned, she sensed a malevolent presence. It was right behind her. She felt a cold grip tugging at her hair, and then a chilling whisper brushed against her ear, "Tanya." She sprinted up the staircase, her short legs carrying her as fast as they could. She burst through the double doors, stepping onto a dimly lit landing. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, lined with closed doors that seemed to vanish into the distance. From the staircase outside, slow, deliberate thuds echoed, each footfall a heavy, agonizing step, like a countdown to impending doom. She dashed forward desperately, trying to open doors, but each one she tried was locked. A door creaked open, revealing the shadowy interior of one of the rooms. Despite every instinct telling her to turn away, she ran inside, and quickly closed the door behind her. Her heart racing, Tanya searched the room looking for a place to hide. Outside, the unseen force neared the room. It drew closer, an oppressive weight that filled the air with dread. The entity hovered outside room 137, although the 7 was now upside down, so the door read 13. Bang! 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 Heavy bangs against the door dissolved into intense silence. Her frantic eyes swept the room, landing on a large window where a tattered leather chair sat before a worn desk. Instinctively, she scrambled underneath the desk, peering through the narrow gap. Silence hung thick. Only the rhythmic drumming of rain and her thundering heartbeat broke the stillness. The door seemed to breathe, its hinges groaning as it inhaled, the wood swelling and creaking with every movement. Then, with a violent shudder, it burst open, splintering into fragments that showered the room. Every sense was on high alert. A floorboard creaked, something was there. The entity pulsed with malevolent energy. The sound of large claws scraped against the wall. Arctic cold permeated the room, accompanied by a putrid stench that almost made her retch. "It's not real," she told herself. "I won't give it power." The mantra repeated, a desperate shield against the approaching entity. A low, guttural growl interrupted her thoughts. Suddenly, a quick succession of thundering footsteps approached. The heavy wooden desk was flung into the air, shattering as it crashed down, leaving her completely exposed. Violent slaps struck her face in rapid succession. Her glasses flew off. Each blow was more brutal than the last. An invisible force seized her hair, yanking her upward with savage brutality. She hung suspended, body contorted, legs dangling helplessly in midair, held by an otherworldly power that defied comprehension. A raw, ear-piercing scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, unbridled terror. Then, without mercy, she was violently hurled to the floor. Trembling, she scrambled backwards, pressing herself into the room's corner like a wounded animal. Her arms wrapped protectively around her knees, creating a desperate shield against the unseen threat. Her eyes, wide and frantic, darted across the shadowy room, scanning every inch for any hint of movement. Her breath escaped invisible, ragged clouds, a stark white against the surrounding darkness. The rain continued its relentless assault against the window. Though no physical presence was visible, she felt its malevolent gaze burning into her. The entity wasn't just attacking, it was savoring her fear, feeding on her terror like a predator toying with its prey before the kill. A violent gust of air rushed toward her, and before she could react, another brutal slap struck her face, snapping her head to the side. She barely had time to gasp before an invisible force lifted her like a rag doll and hurled her against the wall with bone-crushing power. Moments later, she was flung across the room with terrifying speed, slamming into the opposite wall. Then again, and again, her body ricocheted like a lifeless doll, crashing into walls, the floor, and finally the ceiling. She felt her ribs snap, sharp fragments piercing through her dress. Her arm twisted grotesquely at an unnatural angle, and her jaw hung slack, shattered. Blood poured from her mouth in thick rivulets, staining the floor beneath her. The pain was indescribable, an all-consuming agony that overwhelmed every nerve in her body. Pinned against the ceiling by an immense, crushing force, she could feel it pressing against her chest like a boulder. The pressure was unbearable, threatening to flatten her entirely. She rolled helplessly across the ceiling as if gravity itself had turned against her. Then, without warning, the force released its grip, and she plummeted to the floor below. Her leg twisted unnaturally, as it snapped on impact. A searing pain shot through her body before giving way to a dull warmth that spread like poison. She lay crumpled on the wooden floor, unable to move. Her body was too broken, too damaged to fight back. She was utterly defenseless, completely at the mercy of this malevolent being. It wasn't finished with her yet. It shoved her backward across the floor with terrifying ease, dragging her closer and closer to the window behind her. She clawed weakly at the ground but couldn't stop herself from sliding toward it. Then it lifted her again. Suspended in midair like a sacrificial offering, she dangled there for what felt like an eternity. Her wide eyes were filled with terror as a guttural voice pierced through the silence, "You are part of me now." The words were wild and animalistic. Her heart froze as she looked toward the window, and then she was hurled through it with unimaginable force. The glass shattered around her in an explosion of jagged shards that caught the moonlight as they spiraled through the air. Time seemed to slow as she sailed outward into the stormy night. Cold rain lashed against her broken body, stinging like needles on exposed flesh. For a fleeting moment, she looked back toward the shattered window and saw it. The demon loomed in full view, a towering figure of black shadow that seemed to absorb the very essence of light around it. Beside it, a collection of soulless, pale faces hovered, their vacant eyes staring into the abyss as if seeking something they could never find. The shadow's glowing white eyes gleamed with malevolent delight as it watched her fall. Gravity seized her again with brutal finality. Her body twisted in midair as she plummeted toward the ground below with terrifying speed. The world spun around her in a chaotic blur of darkness and rain. She screamed, a raw sound of despair, as cold wind whipped past her face and rain pelted her skin. And then she hit the ground with tremendous speed. Water and blood erupted into the air, spraying outward in a violent arc. The impact was devastating, a sickening thud that silenced everything around her. She lay motionless on the sodden earth, blood streaming from her head and mixing with the muddy puddles beneath her. Her eyes remained open, their lifeless gaze fixed upon the inky blackness of the night sky. Chapter 34, A Blind Run for Freedom. Steve raced through the winding corridors, each turn more desperate than the last. Behind him, a wild, rabid sound erupted, a primal growl that grew increasingly menacing with each passing second. The asylum itself seemed to awaken, doors lining the hallway slamming open and shut in terrifying synchronicity, accompanied by the blood-curdling screams and maddening laughter of the ghosts of former patients. Ice began to form, spreading like a living entity across the walls, ceiling, and floor. The frost advanced rapidly towards him, its crystalline fingers reaching out hungrily towards him. He sprinted as fast as he could, but his foot snagged on a torn carpet. He stumbled, quickly regained his balance, and spun around to face his pursuer. There, a massive black dog stood in the corridor, its eyes burning white like spectral orbs. Then the creature let out a vicious snarling bark and charged. Steve bolted, his feet pounding against the floor. He rounded another corner and found the stairs, taking them two at a time. Uneven steps threatened to send him tumbling, but pure terror kept him upright. At the bottom, he forcefully pushed open two large metal doors, their hinges creaking in protest. He slammed them shut behind him. Absolute, suffocating blackness pressed against his eyes. No flashlight. No guidance. Just pure, primal fear. He was back in the basement, the darkness had been waiting for his return. Panic seized him as he blindly fumbled along the wall, fingers tracing cold stone, searching for any hint of escape. A cold draft whispered against his skin, then the faint sound of rain. His heart leaped. The exit. Miraculously present, where earlier they had searched for an hour without success. He bounded up the concrete steps and burst into a passageway. A surge of excitement coursed through him as freedom neared. The exit, framed by silvery moonlight and shimmering curtains of rain, beckoned him forward. Suddenly, the clang of metal doors echoing from the basement jolted him. Fear propelled him forward with renewed urgency. Freedom was mere meters away. He exploded out of the building, the cool rain a momentary relief on his skin. He sprinted onward, slipping in the mud and crashing onto his back. Scrambling to his feet, he pressed on. A mournful moan reverberated from deep within the basement, sending tendrils of terror through him. He had to escape the grounds. For a heart-stopping moment, he lost his bearings, frantically trying to recall the location of the gates. Then he spotted the path and ran, only to skid to a halt in absolute horror. The massive metal gates were now closed. No, he screamed, whirling around in desperation. Where could he go? Time was running out. Glancing back toward the basement entrance, he froze. A misty, figure-shaped cloud hovered there, advancing ominously. A primal fear tingled through his body, urging him to escape. He turned to the gate, frantically trying to shake it open, desperately attempting to squeeze through the bars, but they were too narrow. In a moment of desperation, he tried to climb, but found no purchase, his hand slipping against the cold metal. The mist drew closer. His gaze darted to the side fence, topped with barbed wire. It was his only chance. He gripped the metal mesh and hauled himself up, not daring to look back. The rain pelted him mercilessly, nearly costing him his grip, but he clung on, inching towards the top. Steve scrambled to pull himself up, hanging by one hand as he struggled to remove his rucksack and coat. With a quick motion, he tossed them onto the barbed wire, creating a makeshift barrier. Below, the mournful groan grew louder, seemingly right beneath him. Adrenaline surged. He heaved himself up, becoming entangled in the barbed wire's loops. Sharp metal bit into his hands, eliciting a scream, but he fought through the pain. He threw himself over, landing on his coat, but it did little to prevent the barbs from snagging him. It was as if the place itself was trying to keep him captive. Rain and tears streamed down his face as he endured excruciating pain. Freedom was so close. He spotted a nearby tree, if he could just stand and jump to it. Shakily, he rose to his feet, wobbling like a tightrope walker on a wire of thorns. Suddenly, ravens erupted from the tree like a swarm of black clouds. They descended upon him, pecking and scratching at his face. He screamed and lost his balance, toppling backward. His legs tangled in the barbed wire, ripping through trousers and flesh as he dangled upside down. The birds viciously attacked his face. He tried to protect himself, arms flailing, but felt a searing pain as they pecked at his eyes. His agonized screams pierced the night as the ravens gouged out his eyes. Finally, his weight pulled him down, dragging some of the barbed wire with him. His body hit the muddy ground with a wet, defeated thud, trapped once more within the asylum's merciless perimeter. Blind and blooded, Steve broke free from the wire. He moved sightless through the mud, slipping and falling repeatedly. He crawled in agony, the sound of rain thunderous in his ears. Rising unsteadily to his feet, he attempted to run but tumbled down a slope into deep, muddy water. The shock of the cold, murky water jolted him. He waded through knee-deep, rain and wind lashing at him. He slipped face first into the cold, dirty water, his hands sinking into the muck as he struggled to push himself up. Suddenly, something forcefully shoved him back down, plunging his face into the icy, murky depths. He tried to surface, but unseen hands forced him down again. He was completely submerged. Filthy liquid flooded his lungs, an indescribable panic erupted as his body violently convulsed, desperate muscles screaming for oxygen. In those final, horrific seconds, his brain registered the absolute betrayal of his own body, muscles weakening, consciousness fragmenting. His last sensory experience, a nightmarish blend of suffocating pressure, burning lungs, and the horrible realization that he was drowning in a muddy, merciless grave within the very grounds he had tried so desperately to escape. His frantic splashes and flailing and struggles gradually became mere twitches, until finally, with a quiet ripple, Steve's movements ceased altogether. His body slowly floated to the surface, head bobbing in the murky water. Rain fell steadily, creating concentric circles around his lifeless form as it drifted from side to side, the steady patter of rain on the muddy water's surface. As the torrential rain gradually eased, a heavy silence settled over Crowley Asylum. Then, with a slow, eerie groan, the iron gates creaked open. Chapter 35, 9 days later, November 8th. A thick mist rolled in, shrouding the scene in an supernatural haze, while police officers moved about, setting up barriers to secure the area and taking photographs to document the scene. Jessica, a news reporter for Worldwide News, stood poised in front of the camera. Dressed in a bright yellow waterproof jacket, which sharply contrasted with the eerie, dim backdrop, she adjusted her microphone and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Preparing to deliver her report. "Okay? Ready?" Jessica asked, her voice steady and confident. She exuded an air of assurance. The man behind the camera nodded. "Ready in 5, 4, 3. He counted down with his fingers, then pointed to her, signaling it was time to begin. "Good evening. I'm Jessica Green, reporting live for Worldwide News. A chilling discovery has been made at Crowley Asylum, where 4 paranormal investigators have been found dead. The group has been identified as Stephen Morrison, 29, Kevin Jones, 37, Tanya Reed, 33, and David Matthews, 37. Their disappearance had raised alarms online, prompting authorities to search the premises. Details surrounding their deaths remain scarce, but preliminary reports indicate a series of bizarre accidents occurred within the derelict building. The exact nature of these incidents is still under investigation. In response to this tragedy, local authorities have cordoned off the asylum and deployed security to prevent any further unauthorized entry. Detective Inspector Alison Thompson issued a stern warning to paranormal investigators and urban explorers, emphasizing the dangers of entering abandoned buildings. "We urge the public to stay away from these hazardous sites, regardless of their intentions," she stated. This is Jessica Green, reporting live from Crowley Asylum for Worldwide News. A dense mist began to rise, steadily obscuring the news team as it thickened and coiled through the air. It swirled around the crumbling walls, creeping closer with each passing moment, slowly swallowing the dark silhouette of the asylum. The fog thickened relentlessly, shrouding the entire structure in its eerie embrace. As it continued to deepen, the asylum disappeared entirely, as though it had never been there at all. The end.